Nancy reluctantly approached the table where the man in expensive clothes was sitting and hurriedly put a cup of coffee in front of him. She was about to leave, but the man grabbed her by the arm and asked in a soulful voice, "Tell me, are the drinks in your establishment only so hot, or the waitresses also?" The girl took a deep breath, trying to hold herself together. She hadn't expected to hear such a tactless question. At that moment, she craved to slap the insolent man, but she knew that in this case she would lose her job. Before Nancy could recover her senses, the man began to unequivocally stroke her hand from the palm to the shoulder. The girl's patience ran out at this point, and she did what she had dreamed of. In the same instant, she rushed out of the hall and closed herself in the storeroom to calm down. Nancy was unusually angry at the man, who thought he had every right to harass the waitress. This cafe was popular with the golden youth, and Nancy had been working here for a little over a month. It was difficult to find a better job in a provincial town. The wages in this place were generous, but the visitors of the cafe were openly hitting on the young waitresses. Most of Nancy's co-workers were comfortable with the brazen behaviour of the wealthy men, who were convinced that they were allowed anything. Many of the waitresses flirted openly, hoping to win over their capricious, cold hearts and turn into a real Cinderella. Nancy was different, and more than once she wanted a more suitable, quiet job. She lived alone, and there were no people around whom she could rely on in times of need. The girl cherished the dream of moving to the capital, but in the meantime she had to tolerate many things in order to just survive in a harsh world. A few minutes later, Nancy's colleague walked into the storeroom. She looked at her with a reproaching look. "Nancy, what have you done? Do you realize that now you will be in big trouble? You slapped the prosecutor's son. He was furious. Couldn't you have worked it out some other way?" "Let the trouble be," Nancy replied in a trembling voice. "I won't let anyone humiliate me or disrespect me. Just because I'm a waitress doesn't mean I'm not human. I didn't show that I could be treated that way." 10 minutes later, the administrator, Cynthia, asked Nancy to help the cooks assemble the order in the kitchen. Soon, Nancy heard noise coming from the hall and decided to find out what was going on. Maybe the prosecutor's son had decided to make a scandal and get her kicked out of here right away. Looking out into the hall, the girl saw Cynthia shouting indignantly at the poorly dressed elderly woman, shrinking and frightened looking at her. "Get out of here! This is no place for you! How dare you come into a respectable place where decent people take a rest?" "Honey, please don't chase me away," pleaded the elderly woman desperately. "I have nowhere to go. I won't disturb anyone. I'll just sit a little, get warm, and go away." Nancy was dumbfounded with surprise. The girl could not understand how Cynthia could treat a defenseless, needy person so cruelly. The elderly woman had bitter tears streaming down her cheeks, and it was obvious that she had spent a lot of time in the frost and had frozen almost to death. Nancy felt genuinely sorry for her and quickly walked up to Cynthia, who was turning red with anger. "Cynthia, how dare you? Stop it immediately!" She remembered how Cynthia behaved with the rich clients, and she was disgusted by this duplicity. There was no dress code in the cafe, and no one told them to kick out the poorly dressed people. Maybe the elderly lady came in just to get a cup of hot tea and keep warm. "Nancy, go back to the kitchen and mind your own business. If you stick up for the homeless, you'll end up on the street yourself. We are not a charity for the homeless and destitute old woman." Nancy had to go back to the kitchen in silence. She felt disgusted by her helplessness. She glanced at her watch and breathed a sigh of relief when she realized that her shift was over. She quickly took the last order and hastily changed her clothes and left. It was unusually cold outside on a late December evening. The snow lay in a thick layer, and a blizzard had been raging relentlessly since dinner. Nancy shuddered with all her body when she noticed on the bench the woman that Cynthia had recently kicked out of the cafe. Without a second's hesitation, Nancy approached the elderly woman. "Excuse me, I live not far from here. If you have nowhere else to go, you can keep me company. I'll treat you to a nice meal, and you can rest and sleep in peace." Mrs. Gilbert looked at Nancy cautiously and distrustfully, and after thinking for a few seconds, she nodded in agreement. The girl took the elderly woman to her house. She hurriedly heated dinner and fed her to her heart's content, and then turned on the kettle and took raspberry jam out of the fridge. "Thank you. You fed me, gave me hot tea and kept me warm. God give you happiness and health, sweetheart," murmured the elderly woman in a trembling voice, looking at Nancy with gratitude. "Fate sometimes strokes a person on the head, and sometimes hits him on the back. I lived with my daughter and her husband, but they were addicted to alcohol. My daughter regularly took my pension, but this time I decided to save money for a rainy day. Unfortunately, my son-in-law found the money and stole it, and my daughter kicked me out of the house, saying that I was going to live off them, that I was a freeloader and a burden. A couple of years ago, she convinced me that I should sign the apartment over to her. She said that in this case, the size of my pension would increase. I did so, but my pension remained the same. Now I have nowhere to go, nowhere to live on. I feel my death is coming. No one will bury me. There is only hope in God. I always felt sorry for those who lived in nursing homes. I was confident that wouldn't happen to me, and now I desperately dream of going there. I'd rather be there." Nancy listened in amazement to Mrs. Gilbert's sad story. She felt hurt and pity for the elderly woman who at the end of her life had lost everything she had dear and was left alone. Although Nancy lived modestly and had barely enough money to live on, she decided that she would not let Mrs. Gilbert leave. The girl was sure that the elderly woman would not survive outdoors in this bitter cold. Besides, the kindest, most magical holiday, which Nancy sincerely loved, was approaching. No one could turn their back on those who are weaker, especially at Christmas time. So, Mrs. Gilbert stayed at Nancy's place. The girl was rarely at home. She worked tirelessly. The elderly woman also did not sit idly by. She cooked food, baked cakes and buns for tea. Nancy always dreamed of grandparents, which she did not have, and Mrs. Gilbert became her true grandmother. One day, during an evening tea party, Mrs. Gilbert took a beautiful gold pendant with a bright blue stone out of her pocket and handed it to Nancy. The girl looked at the elderly woman puzzled and asked, "Mrs. Gilbert, what is it?" "Take it, honey. Now this pendant is yours. You have deserved it. You have an unusually kind heart. May it bring you good luck. Keep you safe." "What are you?" Nancy exclaimed confusedly, with her eyes rounded in surprise. "I cannot accept such an expensive gift. I don't need anything. After all, I have accepted you into my home from the bottom of my heart." "Don't refuse, Nancy. This pendant is a family heirloom. I have no one but you now. You have become like a granddaughter to me, so the pendant should go to you from me." Nancy was pleased to hear that the elderly woman considered her a family member, but she was still uncomfortable. Nevertheless, Mrs. Gilbert was persistent, so Nancy accepted her gift with gratitude and promised the elderly woman never to remove the gold pendant. After Nancy had slapped the prosecutor's son, she had a serious conversation with her superiors. The owner of the cafe did not fire the decent and hard-working girl, but threatened her that if something like that would happen again, she would immediately lose her job. On Christmas Eve, Nancy was annoyed that she had to go to work on the holiday at the request of her boss. The girl was exhausted during the previous shifts, and most of all, she dreamed of resting in a warm, comfortable bed. But Nancy did not want to contradict her boss, so she silently agreed. It was unusually noisy and fun in the cafe. Young people who had recently returned from the ski resort were excitedly and enthusiastically sharing their impressions with each other. An attractive, green-eyed young man was sitting alone at a table near the window, not far from them. He was looking thoughtfully and sadly at the people passing by. The stranger ordered coffee, and Nancy hurried to take it to him. Nancy had never seen him before, and he did not look like a local. Cynthia, too, was interested in the stranger and tried desperately to draw attention to herself. She often approached him and asked him something, smiled meaningfully and tried to lean in so that the stranger noticed and appreciated her décolletage. When the man asked for the bill, Cynthia decided to take the last opportunity to lure the handsome visitor into her net. At this moment, Nancy brought the order to the men who were sitting at the next table. As she was about to leave, one of them said in a defiant tone, "Hey, where are you rushing to, babe? Keep us company. There's no free chair, but you can sit comfortably on my lap. You turned down the prosecutor's son, but you can't turn me down." Nancy instantly got angry, but she gathered her will in a fist and kept silent, remembering the recent conversation with her bosses. She couldn't afford to lose her job, which was her only source of income. She tried to leave with a nonchalant look, but she could not, as one of the men suddenly tripped her. The girl flew swiftly downward, but was able to avoid the fall thanks to a stranger. He quickly reacted and deftly caught Nancy, protecting her from falling. In his arms, Nancy fell into a stupor, and losing track of time, plunged into a maelstrom of green eyes. "Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you," said the man with an affectionate smile. "I wish you never to fall, and if you fall, only into the arms of a decent man." Nancy was even more embarrassed after these words. She thanked the man confused and pulled away from him. The man's gaze suddenly fell on the dainty pendant around the girl's neck. He asked in bewilderment, "Where did you get that pendant? Did you steal it?" Nancy was very upset that he thought she was a thief, but she still calmly explained. "A very kind and sweet old lady gave it to me. I'm sorry, I just actually know the owner of this pendant, and it shocked me to see you wearing it. I'm sorry I accused you of stealing. My name is Henry, by the way." Even though Nancy still felt insulted, she sat down at the table and told Henry about Mrs. Gilbert. The man was in a state of shock. "I can't believe it. Mrs. Gilbert is my grandmother. Please, please take me to her. I have already lost hope of finding her. I need to see my grandmother." When the cafe closed, Nancy took Henry to her house. Deep down, she was scared to bring a stranger into her apartment, but she was willing to take the risk so that Mrs. Gilbert could find her family again. When Nancy opened the door, she was speechless from what she saw. There was a small Christmas tree with colourful toys in the living room. The whole apartment was decorated with multicoloured tinsel and small coniferous compositions. A small puffy snowman adorned the nightstand, and snowflake stickers glittered on the windows. The kitchen smelled like freshly baked goods, and there was champagne on the table. Nancy looked at Mrs. Gilbert, stunned. "How did you manage that? You turned my little apartment into a fairy tale. You've done so much good for me. I wanted to make you happy, kiddo," replied Mrs. Gilbert in a joyful voice, and suddenly she saw her grandson. "Henry, you have remembered your old grandma at last. Come in, dear. Why are you standing there like a dummy? I've got your favourite turkey with apples in the oven." "Grandma, it's been so long since I've seen you. I've been dreaming of coming to your hometown to be with you for at least a week, but I couldn't get away. Life in the capital has many disadvantages, frankly speaking. I stopped to belong to myself. So I finally took a vacation and rushed here to you. Imagine my surprise when I found my mother and stepfather in your apartment, and they were drunk and could hardly stand on their feet. I heard from them that you were on the street. I immediately started looking for you, went to the police, but to no avail. I was so afraid that something could have happened to you on the street in this cold. I still can't believe that my mother was addicted to alcohol so deep. How did she stoop to that level? How dare she kick you out of the house?" Nancy realized that two kindred people had found each other on Christmas Eve. She was genuinely happy for them both. But deep down, she was bitter. Mrs. Gilbert had found her grandson and would soon leave her, and she would be alone again. The girl shook off her sad thoughts and quickly set the table and took out of the oven a delicious Christmas meal, lovingly prepared by the elderly woman. They celebrated Christmas together. Nancy offered Henry to sleep on a small old sofa in the living room, and he willingly agreed. In the morning, during breakfast, the man thoughtfully addressed his grandmother and Nancy. "I have to go back to the capital in 2 days, Grandma. I'll take you with me. I have a spacious apartment. You will be comfortable there. I have a job where I have to spend most of my time in the office, and there are often business trips to other cities and even countries. I wouldn't want to leave you alone. I've been thinking all night about what to do, how to solve this problem. Nancy, if you agree, you could come with us. You'd have your own room. You could take care of my grandmother, look after her, and I would pay you decently. Think about it, Nancy. It's a good offer." Nancy was surprised because she hadn't expected such a turn of events. She had always dreamed of settling down in a big city, finding a good job there, and staying forever. Without thinking twice, she willingly agreed, because there was nothing to keep her in this town. Soon they flew to the capital, and a new life began for Nancy. The girl happily spent time with Mrs. Gilbert. Henry calmly worked and went on business trips without worrying about his grandmother. Soon, Nancy became an essential part of his life. Gradually, the young people became closer and realized that they were meant for each other. Mrs. Gilbert watched Henry and Nancy's relationship with awe and joy. She was quietly happy for them and prayed that their loving hearts would always be together and beat in unison. The next Christmas, Henry and Nancy confessed their feelings to each other, and Henry proposed to the girl. Nancy agreed to become his wife, so another happy family was born on a night that will forever remain in the memory of people who love each other.